We were not unprepared. That is important to understand before anything else. Our modernization programs were advancing with discipline, not improvisation. Missile ranges were extending incrementally. Radar coverage along our coastline was becoming denser, more layered, more redundant. Our pilots were flying longer rotations, incorporating more complex coordination drills. Our analysts studied every American deployment pattern in the Pacific: carrier movements, air wing composition, refueling behavior, exercise timing. We did not observe casually. We observed professionally. We believed we understood the equation. Our coastline was home territory. Geography appeared to offer a natural leverage. The Pacific was vast. Distance seemed to complicate sustained presence for any external power. Supply lines could be stretched. Deployment cycles could be predicted. We were not arrogant, but we were confident. The balance, as we measured it, was narrowing. And yet, we did not win. History often reduces outcomes to strength versus weakness. It assumes one side must have been dramatically inferior. That assumption is comfortable. It simplifies analysis. But there was no collapse, no failure of competence. Our systems functioned. Our calculations were rational. Our officers were disciplined. In simulations, the margins were narrow enough to justify optimism. We believed the Pacific sky could become contested. At the time, we assumed that range, positioning, and incremental modernization would determine the outcome. We measured aircraft counts. We measured missile envelopes. We measured fleet tonnage and air defense density. The variables were tangible, quantifiable. What we did not measure correctly was integration. Only later did we understand that our assumptions had been built around isolated capability, while the competition was operating around systemic cohesion. But that realization came slowly. To understand why the outcome unfolded the way it did, we must return to the period before reassessment, before confidence began to shift into recalibration. The Pacific in the post-Cold War era did not appear volatile. It was not defined by open confrontation. Instead, it was defined by steady adaptation. The United States emerged from the Cold War with global reach, but reach alone does not guarantee dominance. Dominance must be maintained, refined, and embedded into doctrine. Carrier strike groups did not reduce their tempo in the Pacific. If anything, operations became more deliberate. Patrols were framed as reassurance, as presence, as stability. But beneath that visible posture was constant refinement. Each deployment was a systems rehearsal. Airborne early warning cycles were tested repeatedly. Radar overlap zones were recalibrated. Data link reliability improved. Electronic warfare integration tightened. Satellite communication latency decreased. None of these adjustments were dramatic individually. Together, they formed a self-reinforcing structure. Carrier aviation was the visible core of this architecture. Yet the aircraft themselves were only the final expression of a deeper system. An E-2 Hawkeye extended radar coverage far beyond the fleet's immediate horizon. That coverage fed into a network where surface ships, airborne fighters, and command centers shared a common operational picture. Fighters did not rely solely on their own sensors. They operated within a shared awareness envelope. Refueling aircraft extended presence beyond what simple distance calculations predicted. A patrol that appeared limited by fuel capacity was, in practice, prolonged by coordinated tanker support. Electronic warfare platforms introduced uncertainty into detection and targeting. A missile system dependent on reliable tracking could find itself operating with degraded inputs at critical moments. This layering created tempo control. In modern strategy, tempo is not speed alone. It is the compression of decision cycles. Detect, classify, decide, act. The shorter this cycle, the greater the initiative. American doctrine emphasized exactly that compression. Exercises repeatedly stressed joint integration. Air, sea, space, and electronic domains operating within a unified architecture. Across the Pacific, modernization was occurring simultaneously. Missile programs improved precision. Surface-to-air systems expanded in depth. Fighter platforms gained enhanced avionics. On paper, these developments suggested convergence. But convergence in isolated systems does not equal convergence in structure. An advanced missile is only as effective as its targeting network. A dense radar network is only as resilient as its resistance to disruption. A capable aircraft is only as effective as its integration within command and control architecture. American forces had spent decades refining that architecture through global deployments. Carrier aviation culture emphasized repetition under operational stress. Pilots trained not merely in air combat, but in coordinated airspace management. Destroyers and cruisers were not independent escorts. They were sensor nodes. Submarines contributed unseen deterrence beneath the surface. Satellites extended awareness beyond atmospheric limitations. Confidence on our side was grounded in tangible strengths. Geographic proximity reduces logistical strain. Land-based aircraft benefit from stable infrastructure. Coastal defenses can be layered densely and maintained continuously. These are strategic advantages. But advantage depends on assumptions about the adversary's limitations. One assumption was that carriers, as large and visible assets, would avoid operating near contested zones for extended periods. Another was that extended supply chains would constrain endurance. A third was that incremental improvements would gradually erode the operational gap. What emerged instead was adaptability. Carriers repositioned unpredictably. Patrol geometry shifted. Refueling patterns expanded operational envelopes beyond initial estimates. Electronic measures reduced targeting reliability at decisive intervals. The visible deck was not the entire system. It was the focal point of a broader network. Realization rarely arrives in a single dramatic moment. It emerges through repetition, exercise after exercise, deployment after deployment. Pattern recognition replaces optimism. The question shifted subtly. Not, are we improving, but are we improving at the same level of integration? Control of airspace does not require permanent saturation. It requires the ability to establish superiority quickly when escalation demands it. American doctrine emphasized that rapid assertion of control, establish awareness, secure air dominance, expand operational envelope, sustain presence long enough to dictate terms. Missile systems, no matter how advanced, must operate within detection windows. Aircraft, no matter how capable, require reliable information. Surface fleets, no matter how numerous, require overhead protection to maneuver confidently. Each domain depends on the others. By the early 2000s, network-centric concepts matured further. Sensor fusion reduced latency between detection and engagement. Carrier air wings trained in multi-domain scenarios that extended beyond maritime boundaries. The Pacific was no longer simply open airspace. It was monitored space, not constantly dominated, but constantly mapped. The recalibration that followed was not emotional. It was analytical. Competing effectively would require structural change. Surveillance redundancy. Over the horizon, targeting resilience. Layered air defense capable of withstanding disruption. Indigenous carrier development to replicate mobile airbase capability. Satellite networks capable of supporting independent decision cycles. Modernization accelerated accordingly. But systemic architecture cannot be replicated overnight. It requires institutional habit, operational culture, repetition under pressure. The difference was not loud. It was disciplined. In the end, there was no dramatic defeat, no singular engagement that forced admission. The distinction became visible through accumulation. We were not incompetent. Our modernization was real. Our confidence had rational foundations. But rational foundations built on isolated measurement differ from those built on systemic cohesion. We had measured aircraft numbers. We had measured missile envelopes. We had measured proximity. We had not measured architecture. And architecture, once mature, defines tempo. That is why, despite preparation, despite capability, despite confidence. We did not win, not because we lacked strength, but because the system shaping the Pacific sky had been refined for decades before we fully understood its depth. Victory in modern competition does not belong to the side with the loudest display or the closest coastline. It belongs to the side that builds the more resilient structure and sustains it long enough to shape the environment itself. During that defining period in the Pacific, that structure belonged to the United States.